So I'm delighted that we have Professor Tom Shakespeare, who you're an English sociologist, a bioethicist, an author, and this is quite a long one, a Professor of Disability Research in the Medical Faculty of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicines. My kind of first question is, what is a particular challenge you are facing or have faced? And certainly it isn't anything to do with studying or teaching or writing, because you seem to have that nailed.
I'm trying to think of, obviously everybody faces challenges, and I think my challenge at this stage of life is trying to do everything I want to do. And I feel that life is finite and that I have so many things I want to do, and I'm having trouble just doing anything, getting it done. You can see today I've been flustered and all over the place. Today's my day off. I have 4 meetings, all with wonderful people, and it's a bit like that. It's just very busy. There seems to be main demands, finite amount of time, and I am not helping myself in terms of meeting all those demands. If I tell you today that I was run into by a car crossing a side road, I fell when I was changing wheelchairs, and you can't see, but I've got very swollen lip because I've fallen onto my face, really transferring wheelchairs. And those sort of things, I could list the number of things I've dropped, or the small annoyances of daily life, which we all face, but I seem to be very good at muddling all of them together.
I mean, what's really fascinating about your answer is, if you kind of dig a bit deeper, what is it that pushes you? Because I've listened to a lot of your work, listened to your Royal Institute lecture, and you are extremely productive. And I was wondering, is there a connection between impairment and the disability world that you're kind of representing and fighting for, and create a lot of information so that people like me don't have a misunderstanding of it, and this drive you have? What's the link between the two? Maybe there isn't one.
I'm not sure where the drive comes from. I don't know if it is other people in the family who also have that drive. I don't know whether it's connected, as you say, to disability. I think I spend quite a lot of my life trying to explain to people that they're wrong, that it's not what they think, that actually something else is going on. And I try over and over again to influence people, persuade people, and yet keep on getting stuck. And I think that might be something to do with the persistence of negative ideas about disability in our culture. Nobody says, oh, yes, I'm prejudiced. But these ideas are very deep-seated, and I think they take some shifting.
Can I try out, with some trepidation, what I understand your kind of core message is, and then you can put me straight, is that all of us, whether we're non-disabled or disabled, have frailties, fragilities, impairments. Some are visible, some are invisible. Some are physical, some are psychological. They come from different sources. And that the label of disability is framed within a social and cultural context, which creates limits and barriers and resistance and negative attitudes to people who have disabilities, whether they're invisible or visible. And that what you're looking for is a kind of reasonable accommodation, that nobody cares. Like, it wasn't your first challenge that you said that I was born with achondroplasia, I live in a wheelchair. That I knew you were never going to be saying that was the thing that's your challenge, because you want us to kind of recognize that we all have difficulties, and that we want to make a world that makes it so that you can move around, get on a tube, get on a train, get on a plane, go to the loo, have sex, have a nice time, communicate, be heard, be represented on TV or wherever, because you're a big percentage of the world. WHO statistics, 15%. People born with disability, 1%, and then it increases as we age. Have I got it?
You have got it right.
What have I missed?
No, you have got it right, but I think there's actually something more. Because you started by saying, quite rightly, we're all disabled. We all have embodiment. Our bodies, our minds, they're all flawed. And I think that if we start from that place, a lot of the negativity attached to disability is really because that's hard to cope with. We are living in a particularly Western culture, which is all about triumph over our bodies, so the natural world of faster, further, longer, whatever. And to know that actually in the end, our nature, our human nature will come back and bite us is painful. To realize we have limits. Yeah, we're going to die, our mortality, that we have limits. And what I think is that many of if we all have impairments, only 15%, as you say, are seen as defined by their impairments. And I wonder whether our collective failure to really deal with our impaired nature is responsible for the exclusion and the difficulties that we place at the feet of those who we define as having impairments. Almost like there's a sort of transference going on in terms of better than I do, that we are denying some of ourselves and projecting it onto those people who we can see as
the people with
disabled.
disabilities. It's not me.
Exactly. But in fact, we are all limited as we age in all sorts of ways, temporarily or permanently. It is the human condition. And I think there is a sort of pessimistic strand of thought within culture which recognizes this, but it's not the dominant strand. The dominant strand is, oh, we'll overcome, it's not a problem, we're wonderful. And the reality is that we're limited, as you say.
And I think what's coming to mind as you're speaking is that your time is limited. What you want to do within that time is kind of extreme. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, you say this in every possible way, in every format. What would enable you to know that you'd been heard, so that you don't, because what feels like the demand is that you keep kind of shouting and standing from the rooftops or sitting from the rooftops, but you're not heard. So that's what's revving your engine so that you don't say no.
Maybe it's the feeling that you're not heard. And I think there is that, definitely that is going on.
But how would you know that you were heard?
I think you would see, and we are very slowly seeing, you should see a different world. And you'll see a world where people are not judged on their physical or mental capabilities, but are accepted. And we started off the beginning of the podcast, you said, now what should I call you? Should it be this? Should it be that? And I think the more that we are seen each as equal individuals, that whether it's social or physical or intellectual or any distinctions, we are all human beings. And whether we're very seriously impaired or we look great and we're on TV all the time, doesn't matter. We are all fundamentally equal.
I think that I completely and totally agree with you. And in relation to you, though, it feels like you have, did you get this from your dad? What are the roots of it? That you've taken on the responsibility to voice and fight this and give this message that we are all equal. I don't know where others maybe don't.
I don't know where it came from. I do know this, that I picked up the memoirs, if you like, of my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather. He died in 1928. And he said in it, and I never met him, obviously, because I was born in 1966. He said he feels like a person on a busy street who knows where he wants to go, and people are getting in his way, and he's in a hurry to go where he wants to go. And I read this, and I thought, that's me, that is. I recognize that.
It's my genes.
It may be, or genes, or family inheritance, or whatever. It may be that. It may be that we've always been, for generations, like this. My father was not.
What was your father? What did your father teach you?
He was a GP. He was a very good family doctor. And I think he taught me that you could be different, but you are still normal. So he was very normal. He wore a three-piece suit. He was very, as it were, English in his manner. And I think he said, it doesn't matter if you're different, you can be like this. When he became a doctor, there were no disabled doctors. So it was his father wanted him to fit in and said, look, why don't you try to be a manager in the industry? You could do that. And so Dad started that. He wasn't satisfied. He didn't want that. He wanted to become a doctor. He felt strongly he wanted to become a doctor. And against my grandfather's wishes, he went back to college and he studied again, and he did medicine, and he graduated. And he must have been the first or one of the very first disabled doctors at St. George's Medical School and all the rest of it.
Quite
And
amazing.
he triumphed. I mean, if you ever met him, he died, as I say, in 1996. If you ever met him, he was not particularly overwhelming. He was not particularly charismatic. He was quite introverted, but he succeeded. And nowadays, if I'm on the radio on a podcast, then dozens of people get in touch with me and say things like, "Oh, your dad did this. Your
Nice.
dad delivered me.
Oh,
Your dad saved me. Your dad. My
that's
mother
so
was in
nice.
love with your dad," which is very nice for me. But it shows you that people never forget a good doctor, and that
No.
he was a good doctor.
Is there a parallel with what you're doing with being a good doctor, but a different? I'm not try. I don't know. I'm just
Yeah,
being
no,
a
I
scientist in a way, like you, kind of
uh,
examining, looking
I-
what's really going on.
quite rightly. I mean, I think that my father and my mother were, if you like, pillars of the community. My mother she's still alive, of course, but she was parish council chair. She was
Wow.
chair of school governors. She was always busy. And I think there's a feeling that you gave back to your community, that you took a role, and it sometimes a hard role. And I guess I grew up seeing my
Yeah,
father and my
that's the
mother
model.
rush from meeting to meeting to event. And so today with 4 events, it's like, well,
On your day off, for
that's
fuck's sake.
that's what you expect. That it is normal, and it's quite interesting because obviously I have many friends, and not all of them are as busy. And I think, well, what do you do? What on earth do you do all the time? Because in a way, but without us, without the voluntary or independent sector, I think it wouldn't be just the country that fell down. I think it would be the world that fell down, because in voluntary ways, all sorts of people throughout the world keep us going and are never thanked for it, or rarely.
There's something very powerful in that, isn't it? In that when you're giving, because it comes from a place of incredibly strong belief, the overused word passion, but a kind of real meaning and purpose. It is, there's that Jewish saying, if you save one life, you save the world. And it feels like, with just your pair of hands, you're doing your bit to hold up the world. And as I'm saying that, I'm feeling that's quite a responsibility too. And it would be hard to say no. And on the other side of not saying no is that psychologically, of course, busyness is an anesthetic. It stops you feeling. So a lot of people who are busy are kind of pushing away aspects of themselves that they find or don't choose to kind of examine or explore.
Yes. And I wonder what those are. I would, the restlessness, a sort of congenital, drive, or is it a disguise or a cover? I don't know. I mean, all my life I've had periods of therapy, and I've looked at my feelings, and I've changed, and I don't think that I'm the person I was at 20 or whatever. But have I ever really solved or got to the grips, got to the root of it? I'm not sure I have. I think there are things that I know I do well. So, for example, I think that I can speak to an audience very well. And I
You're really
do.
good.
That is what I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is what I do. And I think
You
that
connect. That's the big thing.
I connect with people.
A lot of people speak, but hearing you, I connect to you. So I connected with you before I met you. And so I felt I knew you. And there is a kind of superpower in that, isn't there? In the way that you speak, you make complicated, quite challenging concepts very understandable. You use very human leveling examples, but also you use yourself, so you connect emotionally. So it feels like as I'm talking to you now, I feel like we are connecting with each other. I don't feel like you're just talking to a kind of microphone.
Good. Yes, I think that I plead guilty to all those things. And I don't know where it comes from. And my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great grandparents, maybe they were all good at doing what I do. But I think it's a privilege and a responsibility in the sense that if you can connect with an audience, then whether you're in the clergy or a politician or an academic or a writer, then you need to try and use that force for good and for example, education. I've been in education all my adult life. And I think talking to a group of people, young people particularly, is a great thing. And I know lots of people, we all do it. Lots of people, teachers and lecturers and others do it. But what a wonderful thing that people's minds are open, that they are willing to pick up and learn and develop. And what you say might sow a seed, which later, much later perhaps, comes to bear fruit, if you like. So I think last year, somebody emailed me after maybe 30 years, 25 or 30 years. And they said, what you said to me, and they were a medic. And I'd obviously trained them back in the day, I think at Newcastle University. And probably I supervised, that's right, I supervised their dissertation. And they said, what you taught me has never left me. And they were probably in their 40s or whatever by then. And I was supremely touched, of course.
It's like having a child or something.
It was a wonderful thing. But also, what a tremendous responsibility if you can have that much influence over people. I mean, I'm not saying I changed their life. I don't think I changed their life. But clearly, what I said mattered to them and it influenced them. And that's what they were saying years and years later. And I think what a wonderful thing that you were, whoever, able to make them see differently or enable them, not make, enable them to see something differently. I have no idea what word, what phrase, what image or whatever had such an effect on them, but it clearly did. And that is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
And that gives your life real meaning, and it connects to the label, heading of your website, A Farmer of Thoughts. Like you're kind of looking to plant seeds of ideas, knowledge, water them in the soil, cultivate them so that we learn and change our minds, that we are as human beings learning machines and that we are created to adapt. So you're kind of, feels like you're wanting to help edge us in a better direction.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. Help people think. And that freedom, I'm sure aware that I'm a farmer of thought, crops I raise, I give away, comes from Tom Paine, who is a great 18th century a fighter for freedom in France and America and so forth. And I think that I'm paid to be an academic. Essentially, the government, the university pays me, enables me to live a good life being an academic. And therefore, we live in a world where everything is patented or privatized or trademarked or whatever. And I think that's not what I think. I think that we give it away.
And your website's very generous. I mean, it's a fascinating website. There's a lot of information you've put in there. And as I was going through it, I was wondering, given that you do have physical challenges and that you can get to this podcast, your wheelchair or changing or things, it takes you longer or there's things that gets in the way, and that you have this incredible drive to get so much done, what are there active things that you do that you've learned that supports you? What's enabled you to manage?
What's really interesting, because I had surgery on the 1st of November for my back, and various people came to support me. And one of them was my friend Tom. And he said, he came for the weekend or whatever it was. And he said to me, I think you should have a nap. And I went, what? What do you think I am? A 10-year-old? And I went,
or a
okay.
70-year-old.
Or a 70-year-old. And so I went and lay down, and guess what? I slept. And what I've discovered in the last few years is napping. And maybe it's to do with being older, maybe it's to do with being COVID in the environment or colds or whatever, or surgery. I mean, I had 3 hours or more of general anesthetic. So
That's a
you
big
would be,
thing.
it's a big thing. But this feeling that you can actually, unlike yesterday afternoon, I had no excuse. I had a little sleep for an hour or
Good.
whatever.
You gave yourself permission.
It is a bit like that. It's giving yourself permission not to achieve anything, not to do anything, but just waste time
Just
and
be.
just be. And that is tremendously antithetical to everything I would want to do and be. So I found myself lying on my bed listening to a radio program because I thought, oh, this sounds good. And I listened to the first 5 minutes
Oh my
and
God.
now I woke up. I listened to the last 5 minutes. So I thought, what happened into the intervening 20 minutes? And the answer is, of course, I had a nap. And I think that I particularly, but maybe all of us, feel that we cannot waste time, that every minute is precious, and that we mustn't squander what we've been given. But you're nodding. I'm sure you agree that sometimes actually it's really helpful.
Yeah.
And what's quite interesting is that I'm trying to write at the moment, and that downtime, even if you like, wasted time. So I was my agent said to me, well, all these characters have a good character arc apart from this one. What's going to happen to her? I thought, oh yeah, that's a real problem. And nothing happened to her, but I did have a shower a few weeks later. And in the middle of having a shower, I thought, oh, I know what happens. And that downtime, that it was not a waste. It was the time I needed, because obviously somewhere inside the cogs were whirring, and I was thinking, even though I didn't think I was, and it came out and it was the solution to my problems. And I think that I need to trust that doing nothing will sometimes be the best thing I can do. And
I
that's
think we all
hard
need
because
to
it's
hear that.
letting
Is
go.
that I
Yeah.
wouldn't call it doing nothing. In a way, it's being. It's like giving
Yes.
yourself permission to be, and that when you give yourself that space from that permission, incredible seeds can grow. And if you're trying to remember something, you say, I'm not going to think about it now, and then you
Yeah.
go for a walk and it comes back, or can't remember
Yeah.
your dream, and you and often not thinking is the thing that frees us. But I was also kind of wondering, for people who are listening, who are living in physical pain or any of their different impairments, you have physical pain, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So on the one hand, you campaign for them, but if you were speaking, which is one thing, to improve everybody's way of life and being in the world, but if you're talking to them personally, what are things that you've learned that enabled you to live with a sense of purpose and well-being, given that you have disabilities?
Well, I think one thing is distraction. I mean, that's the obvious answer, that being distracted from your aches, pains, woes is what enables you to be, as it were, yourself. Because if you are focused on pain all the time, it gets worse. And the best thing we can have is whatever it is.
So to move your attention
And
away from it.
exactly. So I think that is very good. But I think the other thing is humor, laughter, because I think, the world is awful, ridiculous. There's all sorts of things wrong.
Crazy.
And we in our lives try to make them better. But ultimately, we will not solve these problems. They're bigger and more intractable than certainly we are. And therefore, I think laughter is actually very, very helpful, very important.
Good
Being
medicine.
silly, good medicine, but I think it frees us from the risk of thinking too much of ourselves. If we can laugh at ourselves, if we can say, well, I am ridiculous, we are all ridiculous. And here I am, 4'5". And historically, people have laughed at dwarfs, at small people, and they found them very funny. They've laughed at people.
That's horrible.
But yet, I've learned, I think, through life to say, actually, laughter is very good. We don't laugh at me, laugh with me, and laugh at the world because it's ridiculous. The story I was going to tell you, Julia, was I've got a woolly hat, and I always lose my hats all the time. Anyway, so I thought I'd better buy a new woolly hat. So I went to the shop at Waterloo to buy a new woolly hat on my way to give a talk. And woolly hats now come in different colours. And then now, in my youth, they were always black. You wore a
Yeah, you
black
had
woolly
one.
hat.
It's like standard.
Now they're beautiful colours. And I thought, well, I'll buy a coloured hat. So I like green. I chose a green hat, and I was about to buy it. And the guy behind the till said, I don't think you want that green hat. I said, I do. What are you saying? Why can't I have the green hat?
What's wrong with
Why do I have to have the black hat all the time? And then I bought it. I was not going to be deterred.
Yeah.
And later I was sitting on an accessible loo, and they had a full-length mirror in the loo. I looked at the loo, and I was wearing a hat. And I looked just like a gnome, just like a garden gnome. The way this green hat on the top of my head came to a point, it could have had a bell on. And I thought, you didn't want to say that, but that's why you didn't want to stand in the green hat. And it was so funny. It was very funny. And I told this story to an audience the other night. And I think that we need to have different images. But the thought I left them with was, he can, I'm not saying he's wrong, he was trying to help me, but the images we have are of laughing little people with pointy hats. Well, we need to get away from that. We need to have different images where we are all ridiculous, or it's not just small people, it's everybody.
We're all absurd.
And nowadays I wear my green hat pulled over my head, so it's not poking up and looking like a gnome's hat.
And so you've got, is it 2 children?
So I've got 2 grown-up children. I was going to say girl, not a girl. She's going to be 36 this year. So definitely a woman who has a child. So in our family, we have Ruby, who she'll be 4 this year. And also I have a son. It's tremendously, and they're both short. All 3 are short. I wrote about this some time ago. So there's me, and then Ivy, and then Ruby, and then Eugene, her partner, and then Rob, my son. So I'm now holding up 6 fingers, I think. I can't count. A lot more fingers. It's a lot of me, a lot of us. And of course, in public, 1 short person is like, oh, short person. 2 is like, what? 7, 6, what is it? Some pantomime or something? And so I think there's a problem for a lot of people in meeting in any number, but there's a particular problem for the likes of us. Because I think again, it comes back.
Do you feel stared at? Like if you will go to someone's birthday and you go to a restaurant?
We don't just feel stared at, we are stared at. There's no doubt about it. And it's a bit like being...
What does that do to you, though? What's the cost? So it's your birthday and they say, look, Dad, we're going to take you out for supper on Thursday and we're going to go to wherever. And
I think
6 of you show up.
You blank it out, because you have to blank it out and you have to not notice, because I think it's a bit like being a celebrity. So once I was at Tate Modern with some friends, and I think in the distance was Ewan McGregor, who's an actor. And my friend rushed up to me and said, oh, Ewan McGregor. And I said, pay no notice. Leave him alone. Do not go up and ask for his autograph. Don't stare. He is a civilian. He is able to have I didn't give the whole spiel, but in my head I was thinking, I'm not stared at because I'm on the TV or making films, but it's the same sort of notoriety. It was quite interesting because I went around with a friend of mine from Finland, and he was horrified by how people stared at me. And he said, what's going on? And he said, this would never happen in Finland. But of course, in Finland, they probably don't make eye contact. So staring at people would be very rude. So it is social convention as much as anything else that allows you to stare or prohibits you from staring. And so we can change it. I would wish that we would not stare at people who are different or behave in different ways. Just let them be. They have a right to be here. Let them be.
Let them be, and look at them like you would anyone on the tube, right? So, I mean, I look at people on the tube, but I don't stare.
It's a bit like the male gaze of women. It's fair enough to go, oh, pretty woman, but if you stare at her, that's harassment. That's wrong. Yeah. We're at liberty to look around. The world is full of fascinating people. And observing is fine, but staring is not fine. Whether it's a black person or a pretty woman or a disabled person or whatever, because...
it feels like it comes with judgment, doesn't it?
It feels like judgment. It feels intrusive, and it makes them feel bad. And I think, however we are in life, we shouldn't be in life making other people feel uncomfortable, feeling bad. that, we are in life to make people feel at home.
Given that you've navigated this and lived with it, are there messages for people listening, but also messages that you've given your children about how to manage it for themselves so that they feel more robust, that they feel...
Don't think I've given explicit messages any more than my father gave me explicit messages. But I hope that they've seen the way that I navigate the world, and that they have learned that they have an equal right to be there, and that they contribute hugely to all sorts of ways in which the world is a better place. And I think for those of us who are not disabled or who are not different, then I think that people come in different shapes and sizes, and we should welcome everybody, and we shouldn't start judging people and rejecting people, and whatever we personally feel about ourselves, that's we have to deal with that, but projecting that onto different people is not the way to be. So I would hope that people learn to accept. And we are people with restricted growth, for example. I think it's 1 in 20,000 or 1 in 40,000. It's very rare, but lots of things are rare. It's just, and it is part of life, and there always have been. And I think that is one of the things about disability. There has always been disabled people. I mean, the image that I showed the other day was of a dwarf from the Egyptian period. So that's 5,000 years old minimum. So they're way back, and they're still, Egypt was notable because it was the land where all children were reared. And what it means is that when you had a disabled child, maybe a restricted growth child or whatever it might be, you still loved and still brought up that child. Whereas in Greece and Rome, you might have exposed that child to death. Now, we don't do that. I hope we don't do that anymore. But in a way, we are also responsible for the way we treat people, and that can be quite exclusionary and quite divisive. Human beings are an unfinished project, aren't they? That's why people like you have a role in the world, because we need to talk about being better people. And one of the ways that we should be better people is more accepting of the diversity in human beings.
I mean, I really do agree. And when I was thinking about you, I was thinking about all the different identities. I carry all the different identities you carry, and you and I have different identities and similar identities. But in every aspect of our identity, whether it's physical impairment or not a physical impairment or whatever it is, the need for each identity is to have a sense of belonging and to be loved, and not to be judged or exiled for that identity. And that's how we're wired as human beings, because we're wired within a tribe to connect and survive, because if you're exiled, you die. And I think at its core, that's what you're saying, is we all belong with each other, and that there isn't a better or a worse.
Yeah, we belong. And I was saying to my colleague this morning, I think there is a richness in diversity. Yes. I think it's really helpful that I have black friends and white friends, and I have Jewish friends and Muslim friends, and I have atheist friends and all the rest of it, because in that diversity, in that it constantly challenges me that these people think differently, and that's okay. And
it's not an echo chamber.
It's and that I will learn.
What would your kind of deathbed sentence be? Is that my life was one of learning, or my life was one of teaching? If you can't die tomorrow, how do you want to be remembered?
I think it's a teacher. I think so. I think a good teacher is always learning. So I don't think it's a finish. But what you said earlier in the interview, only connect. That if we can connect with people, either as teachers or as learners, then we will change. And it's in that change and that constant process of change that we become better.
Yeah. I feel like you have expanded my understanding. I feel very grateful to you. I mean, it is an area I've thought about before, but not for a long time. And so it's kind of focused my mind, and I feel very grateful that I have a greater understanding. I mean, still a lot of ignorance and a lot to learn, but I do feel that in the way that you've been, in the way that you are, and how we've had this conversation, that I've learned, and I'm sure people who are listening have learned too. So I feel very grateful to you.
Thank you for having me, Julia. I really appreciate your time.
I got so much from Tom Shakespeare about a kind of insight into a whole world that shamefully I don't really know enough about. And I wondered what your thoughts were.
I just think it's so interesting that you say it's a world that you don't know much about, because I think one of the things that I really learned listening to Tom was this idea that, I suppose, as a therapist, we've worked with all sorts of disabilities, like visible disabilities, like a physical impairment. I've worked with families, or invisible, like a sort of chronic mental health condition. And there is this recurrent theme that there's something wrong with me. I'm different. I'm defective. I'm not the same as my peers. That comes up a lot, whether it's a mental health condition or a physical disability, or both. And the message I really heard from Tom is that we are all defective. That part of being human is being defective. And to me, that was just an incredibly powerful message. And if that message could sort of become more dominant in society, the sense of I am different would have such a different framing, right? Like, we all have things that we struggle with. And if we could kind of come from that outlook, it would sort of rejig, I think, the way that we see disabilities.
And actually, in that moment, I really got that when I was with him, and I listened to it again, and it shows how, it's my mistake, but it shows how biased I am, and I think maybe all of us are, that I was describing it then again as a different world rather than the very thing that you were saying. And I sort of default moded fell into it, that we are all part of the same world. And the more that we can, as you said, recognize that, and some are more visible than others, then we'll have a more cohesive society.
Yeah, I think we don't want to dwell on frailties because of our own fears, right? And I think it's a lot to do with projection, isn't it? That we don't want to think of our own frailties, our own vulnerabilities, and so we sort of project onto the other this idea that you're frail, there's something wrong with you, and I don't want to deal with it or see it, or but actually it's to do with our own fears of our own impermanence.
Yes, and it's like Tom has that skill as a result of his research and his experience and his kind of life wisdom, really, that it's so hard, as you said, Mum, to step back from what is our cultural lens is our default lens. And when he said that phrase, we all have, frailties, but only 15% of us are defined as disabled. And it's like we create the division culturally, societally, with our language, with our perspective, with our discrimination. It's like he's trying to rebuild the bridge and go, no, we're all the same. We're all the same in the sense that we're all different, and we all have limitations, and we all have common humanity. And somehow also that we seem to, as a species, get more hooked on visual difference than we do on other forms of difference. That seems to be a really dominant way that we seem to use difference, don't we? And I don't know why that is, if we're ever so very visual.
It's maybe more obvious.
It's more identifiable.
Yeah.
But that idea of walking into a restaurant with 6 or 7 of his family and being stared at like they were traveling circus was so horrendous. And I am sure I would be one of the starers. That's the awful thing. And so I hope I remember that when I'm out and about in the world, and that I can look and observe but not stare. He made such a good, clear distinction between looking and observing and sort of participating in your surroundings and being intrusive and breaking through a boundary by, staring.
I was so interested in Tom's experience of being stared at, like you were talking about, Mum, instead of being. And I was thinking about how children are often much more impulsive than adults, because their brain hasn't developed yet and they don't have the same filter. So I think, I know people have definitely had the experience of children sort of going up to them in the supermarket and either staring or sort of saying like, why don't you have a leg? And you sort of see a parents like slightly scrambling in the background, like, oh no, embarrassed and sort of not sure what to say. And I think I was really curious as to, is that different? Is that experience different to an adult sort of staring at you in a restaurant? Is there something about a sort of childhood curiosity that makes it feel less of imposition or a othering, like being
or
in
judgment,
judgment,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because
yeah, that's the word.
Because a child, those things it's not it's curiosity, not judgment. Whereas I guess as an adult, we perceive those parents being judged as judgment, as negative thoughts about them. I also think, from a sort of parenting point of view, I guess those moments are kind of opportunities as well, aren't they? There are opportunities to have conversations about difference and about fact we may look different, but we're actually all the same. And there's a kind of helpful moment actually from a parenting point of view to help reframe this, this narrative, this kind of perspective that we struggle to get away from, that we've sort of grown up with.
Yeah.
That we can do differently for our children.
I think that's such a good point. And I think it sort of links back to what I was also thinking about, which is really about representation and why representation is so important. And, I think we obviously still have a hugely long way to go in terms of representation, but I think it is generally better. Like if you buy a children's book, often they do have lots of different types of bodies in them. Or like in Sesame Street, they have a little girl character called Julia, who's on the autistic spectrum. And it's kind of about normalizing a little girl on the autistic spectrum, that, she plays with her friends and she does all these other things. And there are these things that she finds hard in the same way that Elmo has things that Elmo finds hard. And so I think that those are sort of small things, aren't they? But I think we are sort of hopefully moving in the right direction, even if it's very, very slow.
Yeah, I think so.
I also think that I would hope that in terms of sort of this idea that, we all, like you say, and that we all have frailties, Elmo and Julia find things hard, that for so many of us, if we have the ability to sort of support and process, it's actually also often those frailties that are a great source of like learning and growth and empathy, right? So much sort of unprocessed, unsupported suffering often makes us become rigid and hard and unreceptive. But actually, if we're able to make sense of our wounds, whatever they are, physical, emotional, then often that allows us to be much more open and inclusive and non-judgmental to our fellow man, because we've been there. We know that we can be like that and X and Y, and we can snap, and actually that's part of pain, whatever the version of that is. And a quote that I always think of is, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. And
it's very true.
I think that's true for Tom, isn't it? It's like his unique experience of disability is actually one of his greatest offerings.
And his website is also a really amazing offering. So if you haven't been on the Farmer of Thoughts website, definitely go on it. It's very rich and interesting and full of excellent quotes. Mum, if you ever need a Friday quote for your Insta, get on that Farmer of Thoughts website. Lots of inspirational thoughts there.
One thing I wanted to, which is a change of direction, but when you first asked, what's your biggest challenge to him? His biggest challenge was about there's just so much to do and not enough time. It reminded me, I'm someone who often has this internal feeling of being late, which I know is not really what he was talking about. He was talking about kind of, gosh, life is so precious and short and there's so much good stuff to get into it. But I often live with it, and I don't know how common this is, but just feeling like I'm behind, or like I should be rushing, like the next thing, and then that psychological state. I do it to my children as well in the morning, like going to school. Like, come on, we're late. Not late. I've never been late. But most mornings I'm like scaring the pants off them to get out the door. And I used to see this craniosacral therapist, and at the end he used to say, "Don't rush," or at least don't feel like you're rushing.
Nice.
And I just found it a really useful distinction of like, I can do the same movements without the same mental state. You know, like I can move at speed, or I can do a lot of things in a day
That the fluster.
without the mental state of like,
Yeah.
without the fluster, and without this sort of paranoid feeling that there's too much to do and not enough time.
That's a lovely thought.
And it just
Yeah.
made me think of that.
And also it made me think of like this, I think, conflict that a lot of us have of the drive versus the enjoying being, and how do we balance those? Or like, you know, I think often it plays out in sort of ambition versus being with our friends or our family or whatever, and how do we balance? Like, it's really important to enjoy the things we have and just be, but actually also there's so many things that I want to achieve and get done, and also so many things that just have to be done whether I want to achieve them or not. How do we have both? And I think probably everybody's sort of weighted on that spectrum slightly differently, and he's on the very much drive, do everything end of the spectrum, and I feel like I'm pushed up further back of the I want to do stuff, but I also feel conflicted. Like I want to just be too.
Yeah. The only other thought I had when you were talking was this idea that, you know, looking down on and sort of going for the fastest, you know, that kind of survival of the fittest mentality, which is what we don't want to be doing. I wonder, I don't know what you think, whether that is kind of physiologically wired in us, and so that we very much have to consciously kind of recognize it and step outside it and choose to behave differently. All right, my darlings. Well, particular thanks to Tom Shakespeare for his honesty and openness and his kind of great depth of knowledge and his fire to get that out in the world. I thought was incredibly powerful. Thank you to all of you for listening. And if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, it's on Substack. And if you think there's somebody who could enjoy or benefit from this conversation, do please share it. And to help people find us, do rate and subscribe. Thank you very